On the frozen surface of a distant planet, the wind howled like a wild beast, tearing through the barren landscape. Snow swirled through the air, biting at everything it touched. In the midst of this desolation, a small makeshift shelter stood, barely holding against the icy storm outside. Inside, an alien mother held her child tightly, her heart heavy with sorrow. Her name was Alira. Her skin, once a vibrant shade of blue, now looked dull and faded, as though the cold had drained her very soul. She wrapped her arms around her child, a tiny, fragile thing named Taro, who clung to her with desperate strength. His eyes were wide with fear, but the warmth of his tiny body against hers gave her the last comfort she had left. She had kept him alive this long, but she knew, deep down, that their time was running out. Alira had been alone for weeks now, after a disaster had struck her people. The survivors of her colony were few, scattered across the frozen wasteland, and the supplies they had managed to gather had long since run out. The cold was relentless. It crept in everywhere, into their bones, into their hearts, into their very thoughts. She had tried everything. She had used every piece of equipment she could find, but nothing could stop the inevitable. She had taken Taro into the shelter, hoping that somehow, with what little warmth was left, they might survive. Another night. But the temperature outside had dropped again, and their shelter, made from scavenged materials, could only hold so much warmth before it was overpowered by the cold. She could feel her body growing weaker with every passing minute, and her breath came in short, shallow gasps. Alira had never imagined she would end like this, alone with her child on an alien world. She had never thought she would be reduced to this, waiting for the cold to take her, hoping it would come quickly so that the suffering would end. She had always been strong, a leader among her people, always fighting for survival. But now, in the face of this endless winter, she had nothing left to give. She held Taro close, her tears mixing with the frozen air as she whispered words of comfort to him. "Sleep, my little one," she said softly, trying to keep the fear out of her voice. "Rest, it will all be over soon." Taro did not respond. He was too weak, too cold. His small hands grasped at her as though trying to hold on to something, anything, to keep the darkness away. Alira gently kissed his forehead, her lips cold against his skin, and closed her eyes. She had done everything she could. Now, all she could do was wait. The storm outside grew fiercer. The howling wind seemed to shake the walls of the shelter, threatening to tear it apart. Alira knew she had only moments left. She had fought so hard for so long, but now she was ready to let go. The weight of her exhaustion, her hopelessness, was too much to bear. She squeezed her eyes shut and let the cold creep in. Feeling it enter her body like 1,000 icy needles, her heart slowed, and she could feel the numbness spreading through her limbs. It wasn't painful. No, it was peaceful in a strange way. The cold was her friend now, offering her a final release. She pressed her face into Taro's hair, inhaling the scent of him one last time, before allowing herself to drift away into the abyss. But just as she was about to succumb to the darkness, something changed. A faint light flickered outside the shelter, growing brighter as it approached. Alira's eyes fluttered open, her body trembling with the last bit of strength she had. The light was not the storm's pale reflection, but something different, something warm. She could hardly believe it. Was it a dream, or had the cold finally taken her? She struggled to sit up, her body protesting with every movement. She held Taro tighter against her, shielding him as best she could. The light grew brighter, and soon the unmistakable shape of a human figure appeared in the doorway of the shelter. Alira's breath caught in her throat. A human? Here? On this frozen world? The figure was tall, his silhouette barely visible through the blinding snow. He seemed to move with purpose, his movement steady despite the storm. Alira could hardly believe her eyes. Was this a hallucination? Had she finally lost her mind from the cold? But no, this was real. This human was here, standing at the threshold of the shelter, a figure of warmth and life in the middle of this desolate cold. For a moment, she could only stare, too weak to speak, too stunned to move. The human looked at her, his face partially obscured by the storm, But his eyes, those eyes were filled with something Alira had not seen in so long. Hope. The human stepped into the shelter, his movements cautious but determined. He knelt down beside Alira and Taro, his presence a strange contrast to the endless cold that had surrounded them. Alira could feel the warmth of him even through the numbness that had overtaken her. He spoke, his voice calm and reassuring despite the chaos outside. "You're not alone," he said simply. "I'm here to help." Alira wanted to speak, to thank him, to say anything. But her body refused to obey. She could only stare, her heart filled with confusion and wonder. How had this human found them in the middle of this icy wasteland? How had he survived the storm to reach her? The human didn't wait for her to respond. He immediately began to work, using equipment from his pack to create a small source of warmth. Alira felt the heat spread, first in the air around her and then in her own body. She gasped, her breath catching as life began to return to her. Frozen limbs. The human continued to work quickly, never looking up from his task. He checked on Taro, making sure the child was warm enough, before returning his focus to Alira. With each passing moment, the warmth in the shelter grew. Alira felt the numbness slowly fade, and with it, a spark of life returned to her heart. As the warmth surrounded them, Alira finally found her voice. "Who are you?" she whispered, her words barely audible in the stillness of the shelter. The human looked up, his eyes meeting hers. "I'm just a traveler," he said with a small, reassuring smile. "I couldn't leave you out here, not like this." Alira could hardly believe what she was hearing. A human had saved them, pulled them from the brink of death. She had thought it was too late, that the cold had claimed them both. But now, thanks to this stranger, she had another chance to live. As she looked at the human, her heart swelled with gratitude, and for the first time in what felt like forever, she allowed herself to hope. The shelter, once a cold, desolate place, now felt warmer with the human's presence. The warmth, slowly spreading through the air, revived something deep inside Alira. She could feel her limbs tingling as blood began to flow again, her skin slowly coming back to life after the frozen numbness that had gripped her. She had not expected to be alive, let alone feel warmth again. She looked at the human in wonder, unable to fully understand how he had come to them. His actions were calm, precise. He worked quickly, but with a careful attention to detail, setting up a portable heating unit to help them regain their strength. His face was strong, but there was a kindness in his eyes that made Alira feel something unfamiliar. Trust. She had never trusted anyone so easily, especially not a human, someone from a distant foreign world. Yet here she was, wrapped in warmth. Saved by this man. As the heating unit hummed softly, filling the small shelter with heat, the human moved closer. He took off his jacket, revealing a set of functional yet worn clothing beneath. He didn't speak at first, but his gaze kept drifting back to Taro, who lay weak but still clinging to Alira. She could see the concern in his eyes, and it made her wonder if he saw them as nothing more than survivors of a tragedy, or if there was something more. The human spoke, his voice low but comforting. "You both were close to freezing," he said. "I've been searching this area for days, hoping to find someone. I didn't think I'd actually come across anyone alive out here." Alira could feel the disbelief in his words, and for a moment, she shared it. How had they survived this long alone in a place like this? The wind outside seemed to grow louder, the storm still raging as if the universe itself were trying to sweep them away. She had thought it would be the end, but now, thanks to this human, there was a spark of life left in them. Her voice, weak and strained, barely rose above a whisper. "Why why are you here?" The human glanced at her, his eyes narrowing slightly, not in suspicion but in curiosity. He seemed to consider the question for a long moment, almost as if the answer were too complicated to explain in just a few words. "I'm stranded," he said finally. "My ship crashed. I've been trying to find a way back home, but the weather here it's not exactly friendly." Alira's mind tried to process what he was saying. A human stranded on this planet in the middle of nowhere with a ship in ruins. She couldn't quite understand how someone like him had found his way to them. The chances seemed slim, even impossible. Yet here he was, saving them from certain death. "What are you going to do now?" Alira asked, still not entirely sure what to make of this strange encounter. The storm outside raged on, the winds howling as if they were trying to swallow the entire planet. The human seemed like an angel sent to rescue them, but she had learned long ago not to trust anyone easily. She needed to know more. "I'll get you out of here," he said simply. His words were full of confidence, as though there was no question that they would survive this. Alira couldn't help but feel a flicker of hope at his words, though she quickly tried to suppress it. Hope could be dangerous. It had been cruel to her before, only to be crushed under the weight of reality. But something about this human made her feel like it might be different this time. He moved to the corner of the shelter and began pulling supplies from his bag. It was clear he had been prepared for a long journey, carrying tools and survival equipment that seemed far more advanced than what Alira had ever seen. He spoke as he worked, his voice casual yet reassuring. "There's a communications device in my pack. I can try to call for help. We just need to get to a safer spot." Alira's thoughts raced. A communications device. Could he really call for help? Could they be rescued? She hadn't even considered the possibility of leaving this frozen world. Her entire focus had been on survival, on keeping Taro alive. But the thought of escaping, of going somewhere warm, somewhere safe, was almost too much to hope for. It was a dream, something too far out of reach. Yet, hearing the human's words made it feel almost real. "Can we trust it?" Alira asked, her voice sharp with caution. The human paused and looked at her, meeting her gaze with a level of sincerity that made her pause. "You can trust me," he said simply. "I'm not here to hurt you. I'm here to help." Alira studied his face for a long moment as if trying to see through the human's words. Her instincts, honed over years of surviving on a harsh and unforgiving planet, told her to be wary. But there was something in the way he spoke, something in his eyes, that made her wonder if she was finally meeting someone who could be trusted. She nodded slowly, still unsure but willing to give him a chance. "We'll need supplies," she said. "Our shelter is barely enough to keep us alive, and we can't stay here much longer." The human nodded in agreement. "I've got some rations in my bag. It's not much, but it's better than nothing. We'll need to move quickly, though. The storm is only going to get worse." Alira glanced at Taro, still curled up in her arms. He was breathing more steadily now, thanks to the warmth, but his small frame still trembled with the after-effects of the cold. She could feel the weight of her responsibilities pressing on her chest, but she knew she had no choice. If there was even the slightest chance of getting off this planet, of giving Taro a better life, she had to take it. She looked back at the human, who was now securing the communication device and checking the supplies in his pack. His calm demeanor was infectious, and for the first time in what felt like forever, Alira allowed herself to hope. Maybe, just maybe, they could escape this place. She wasn't ready to give up yet. "We're ready," she said, her voice firmer. Now, she wasn't sure what the future held, but she knew one thing for sure. She wasn't going to die here. "Not today." The human nodded. "All right then. We'll move out at first light. Stay close and we'll make it through this." Alira wasn't sure how long it would take to get to safety or if they could make it, but for the first time in a long while she felt a small spark of belief in the human's words. She wasn't alone anymore. They weren't alone. And for that, she was grateful. As the night drew on and the storm continued to rage outside, Alira sat back against the shelter's wall, feeling the warmth wrap around her like a blanket. She looked down at Taro, still sleeping soundly in her arms. No matter what happened next, she would fight for him. She had no choice, and maybe, just maybe, this human would help them escape the cold and give them a future they thought was lost forever. The morning arrived with the sound of the storm howling even louder outside the shelter. Alira opened her eyes, feeling the warmth of the heater still radiating through the small room. The night had been long and cold, but the human's presence had kept the worst of it at bay. She shifted slightly, careful not to disturb Taro, who had finally found a peaceful, though fragile, sleep in her arms. His small breaths were steady now, though his body still trembled lightly from the cold. "Alira," rubbed her eyes, trying to gather the strength to get up. The storm outside was relentless, and the thought of leaving the shelter, where they had found even a little safety, made her anxious, but she couldn't ignore the human's words. They couldn't stay here much longer. The cold would find them again, and when it did, it would be harder to fight back. The human he had yet to introduce himself was already awake, organizing his gear and checking the communication device he had mentioned the night before. Alira watched him quietly for a moment, wondering what had brought him here. Why would a stranger, someone from a distant world, go so far to help two beings he didn't even know? It didn't make sense, and yet she could feel the sincerity in his actions. She hadn't felt this kind of trust in a long time, especially not from someone so different from herself. "Are you ready?" the human asked, his voice steady as he noticed Alira stir. His face was partially covered by a hood, his eyes still shadowed, but there was a warmth in his tone that felt comforting. Alira nodded slowly, her heart pounding. "I'm ready, but the storm, it's still too strong. Won't we freeze before we even get far?" The human smiled a little, his eyes glinting with a determination she couldn't quite understand. "I've been through worse storms than this. We can make it. But we need to move quickly. If we stay here any longer, we'll lose the chance to get out of this." His confidence was a strange comfort. Alira had grown used to survival by her own strength and instincts, but something about this human is calm. His certainty made her believe that they could make it. They had no other choice. She looked down at Taro, who was still curled up in her arms, vulnerable but alive. Her son had already been through so much, and the thought of putting him back into the cold again was terrifying. But this human, this stranger, had shown them both kindness and hope. Maybe it was time to trust in something other than her own survival instincts. "I trust you," she said softly, her voice tinged with uncertainty but filled with a glimmer of hope. "Let's go." The human nodded and began to gather the rest of his equipment. He adjusted his pack, checked the communication device one last time, and then turned to face Alira. He seemed to assess the situation one more time, then made his way toward the shelter's door. Alira followed slowly, the weight of Taro in her arms making every step feel heavier, but she knew there was no turning back now. This was their chance. The human held the door open for her. A small gesture, but one that made her feel a little less alone in the world. The storm outside was brutal, the snow swirling like a living thing, fiercely cutting through the air. But in that moment, it didn't seem as terrifying. The human was beside her. They were no longer alone, not fully. And for the first time in a long while, she didn't feel like she was fighting alone anymore. The cold bit into her skin as soon as she stepped outside. The wind tearing at her face, but it wasn't as overwhelming as it had been. The human was leading the way, moving with the confidence of someone who had weathered worse. Alira held Taro closer, feeling the small warmth of his body against her own. She couldn't let go of him, not now. Not when they were so close to something that felt like safety. As they moved, the human glanced back occasionally, making sure Alira was keeping up. He didn't speak much as they trudged through the snow, but his actions spoke louder than any words could. He seemed to know exactly where he was going, his path steady and sure, cutting through the storm as though it didn't even exist. After what felt like hours, they finally reached a small rise in the landscape. The storm seemed to ease a little as they crested it, and Alira could see beyond through the swirling white. There, just over the hill, she saw a faint glow, a sign of life, maybe. Alira couldn't be sure, but it filled her with a strange sense of hope. The human slowed his pace as they neared the glow. He looked at Alira, his eyes scanning the horizon. "We're close now. That light is from a signal beacon I set up before the storm hit. It should be able to call for help, or at least get us off this planet." Alira's heart raced as the realization sank in. This wasn't just some random chance. The human had planned this, had known what to do. He hadn't just stumbled upon them by accident. He had come for them, for her and Taro. They reached the beacon, and the human quickly set to work, activating the device with practiced ease. Alira watched, her mind still reeling from the events of the past few hours. It seemed impossible, but here they were. The beacon was sending out a signal, reaching beyond the planet's harsh atmosphere to anyone who could hear it. There was hope. As the device hummed with activity, the human looked at her, a quiet smile on his face. Now we wait. The signal will reach my people. We just need to hold out a little longer. Alira felt a surge of emotion well up inside her. The cold was still biting, the wind still howling, but in this moment she felt something she hadn't. In so long relief, it wasn't over yet, but there was a chance. There was someone who cared. For the first time in weeks, she could see the possibility of a future beyond the cold. She looked down at Taro, who had started to stir in her arms. His eyes were half open, still clouded with sleep, but clearly sensing that something was different. Alira kissed the top of his head softly, brushing a few strands of hair from his face. "We're going to be okay," she whispered to him, though she wasn't entirely sure who she was trying to reassure. Him or herself? The human watched them, his expression softening. "You're both stronger than you realize," he said quietly. "You made it this far. Now we just need to make it the rest of the way." Alira nodded, feeling a warmth fill her chest. She had no idea what the future held, but for the first time in a long time, she felt like she wasn't fighting alone anymore. The storm raged on around them, but in the heart of it, they stood together, two strangers fighting for a future in a world that had tried to take everything from them. And they weren't giving up. The cold wind whipped through the air, biting at their exposed faces as the storm continued its relentless assault. Alira held Taro close to her, his small body still wrapped tightly in her arms. Her heart raced with every step, but she focused on the human beside her, trusting him to lead the way. The beacon they had activated was a beacon of hope, yet they were still far from safety. The storm had grown fiercer again, as though the world itself were trying to push them back. But Alira refused to give up. The human had shown her more in the past hours than she could have imagined. His presence was steady and strong, like an anchor in the midst of the raging storm. Even though she had no idea who he was or where he had come from, she couldn't deny the trust that had begun to build between them. He was her lifeline, and for the first time since the cold had taken so much from her, Alira allowed herself to believe in the possibility of a future. "Stay close," the human said, his voice calm but urgent as he continued to navigate the icy terrain. His pace didn't slow, even as the wind picked up again, trying to tear at their clothing and make every step feel like a struggle. But the human pressed on, his eyes scanning the surroundings as he led them to a new spot. Sheltered from the worst of the wind by a small rise in the land, Alira looked around, catching her breath as the storm began to lose some of its intensity. The light from the beacon they had activated seemed to flicker in the distance, a beacon of hope calling out to anyone who might hear it. Alira's heart pounded, the weight of the journey heavy on her shoulders, but for the first time in what felt like forever, she felt like they might make it. They stopped for a moment, allowing Alira to catch her breath. She sat down carefully, still holding Taro close to her chest. The child was barely awake, his tiny hands still weak, but he clung to her with every ounce of energy he had left. Alira pressed a kiss to his forehead, her mind racing with thoughts of their future. "Are we close?" she asked, her voice faint from exhaustion. She wasn't sure how much longer she could keep moving, but she didn't want to stop now. Not when they were so close to something she couldn't yet understand. The human glanced at her, his eyes sharp as he surveyed the terrain. "Almost," he replied. "We just need to push through a little more. Keep close, we're nearly there." Alira nodded, though her body screamed for rest. She couldn't afford to stop, not when the future was just out of reach. She had already seen too much loss in her life, and she wasn't ready to add her son to the list. Taro was still weak, but his breath was steadier now, and his eyes opened every so often to look at her. His tiny fingers still gripping her sleeve. As they continued forward, Alira's thoughts began to drift. She thought of her home, of the colony they had lost, of the people who had once stood beside her. She had been a leader, a protector. Now she was a mother, fighting to protect the only family she had left. The world had changed, but one thing had remained constant: her desire to survive. The human turned to her again, noticing her quiet expression. "Hey," he said gently, I know it's tough, but we're getting there. Just a little longer. You and your son are strong. I've seen it in the way you fought to survive. Alira met his gaze, her heart swelling with something she hadn't felt in so long. Gratitude. Thank you, she whispered. She wasn't sure how much more she could express, but the human had given them a chance. He had saved their lives. When all hope seemed lost, the human nodded, his face serious but calm. We'll get through this together. The words were simple, but they carried a weight that Alira could feel in her bones. She wasn't alone anymore. She wasn't carrying the burden on her shoulders alone. She had someone to share it with. The thought was both strange and comforting, but she knew it was true. This stranger, was now a part of their story. Minutes passed as they continued to move, each step a small victory against the storm. The light from the beacon grew stronger with every step, until finally, Alira saw the outline of a larger structure in the distance. It was a small, makeshift shelter, but it was more than they could have hoped for, a place of refuge. A place where they could rest, regroup, and finally let go of the fight against the cold. We're here, the human said, his voice filled with quiet triumph. Alira felt her heart leap in her chest. They had made it. She looked at Taro, whose eyes were beginning to flutter open, and smiled softly at him. We're safe now, little one, she whispered. We made it. The human led them to the shelter, and as they stepped inside, Alira finally allowed herself to relax. The storm was still raging outside, but the walls of the shelter blocked out the worst of it. The warmth inside was a balm to their frozen skin, and Alira could feel the tension that had gripped her for so long slowly beginning to melt away. Taro, still weak but now alert, looked up at her with tired eyes. He didn't speak, but his small hand reached for hers and she squeezed it gently. Thank you, Alira said to the human again, this time with more depth in her voice. The gratitude she felt for this stranger who had given them a second chance was overwhelming. The human gave her a small smile, though his exhaustion was evident. We're not out of the woods yet, he said, but there was a sense of relief in his voice that Alira hadn't heard before. But we've made it this far, and that's something. They settled into the shelter, the warmth gradually returning to their bodies as they sat down. The human checked the communication device once more, ensuring it was still transmitting the signal. It wasn't perfect, but it was enough. They were safe for now. Alira looked at the human, her eyes filled with silent thanks. She didn't know how to repay him, but she knew she would find a way. This was a beginning, not just for her and Taro, but for all of them. The human had become a part of their story, and no matter what happened next, that would always be true. Outside, the storm raged on, but inside the shelter there was warmth, there was hope. And for the first time in a long while, Alira allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, they could start over. The storm outside continued to howl, but inside the shelter there was peace. The wind could not reach them now. The walls of the shelter, though simple and small, were enough to keep the worst of the cold at bay. The human had worked tirelessly to make sure they were safe, and now, as Alira sat beside her son, she felt a weight begin to lift from her shoulders. Taro had fallen into a deep sleep, his small body curled up beside her. Alira gently stroked his hair, her heart full of both relief and love. She had been so close to losing him, so close to the end, but now they had a chance. A real chance. The human, who had introduced himself as Alex, sat across from them, working on the communication device. It had taken some time, but he had managed to send a signal for help. There was no guarantee that anyone would receive it, but it was the only hope they had. He had told her that it could take hours, maybe even days, for a rescue team to reach them, depending on how far their distress signal had traveled. Alira glanced at Alex, her eyes filled with gratitude. She still didn't fully understand why he had come for them, why he had risked his life to save two strangers, but there was no mistaking the kindness in his eyes. He had already done more than she could have ever expected from anyone, especially a human. She had been taught to be wary of them, of any being that was not her own kind, but Alex had shown her something different. He had shown her the power of compassion, the strength that came from caring for others. Thank you, Alira said quietly, her voice soft but full of meaning. "You didn't have to help us." "But you did." Alex looked up from his work, meeting her gaze with a small, knowing smile. "I didn't have much of a choice," he said, his tone light but sincere. "When I found you, I could see that you were on the brink of losing everything. I couldn't just leave you there." His words echoed in Alira's mind, and she felt a warmth spread through her chest. It wasn't just the physical warmth of the shelter. It was something deeper, something she hadn't felt in so long. It was a feeling of safety, of belonging, of being seen. "You're a good person," she said, her voice filled with quiet admiration. Alex chuckled softly, rubbing the back of his neck. "I'm just doing what anyone would do in my place." Alira shook her head. "Not everyone would have done what you did. Most would have left us to die, but you didn't." Alex's smile faded slightly as he glanced at Taro, who was still asleep beside Alira. "You and your son are fighters," he said. "You've already proven that. I just helped you finish what you started." Alira felt a lump form in her throat. She hadn't expected this kindness, this understanding. It made her realize how much she had been missing. She had spent so long in survival mode, fighting for every breath, for every scrap of food, and for her son's life. But now, with Alex by her side, she felt like she could breathe again, like there was a way forward. She watched as Alex turned his attention back to the communication device. He had been fiddling with it for a while, trying to get a stronger signal. His brow furrowed in concentration, his hands working quickly and efficiently. She had never seen anyone so focused, so determined. It reminded her of herself back when she had been a leader of her people, back when she had been strong. "We're getting closer," Alex said, breaking her thoughts. "The signal is getting through?" "It's just a matter of time now," Alira nodded, though she still had doubts. The storm outside made everything feel uncertain. How far had the signal really traveled? Would help come in time? She wanted to believe it, wanted to believe that they had a future beyond this frozen wasteland, but the memories of loss and pain still lingered. She had seen too much of it, lost too much to think it would be that easy, but Alex's words offered a small sliver of hope, and that was enough for now. Taro stirred beside her, his tiny hands reaching out in his sleep. Alira gently picked him up, cradling him in her arms. He was still so small, so fragile. She had to protect him. She had to keep him safe, no matter what it took. "Once we're rescued, what will you do?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Alex looked up at her, his eyes thoughtful. "I don't know," he said honestly. "I came here to find a way off this planet, but now I think I'll stay. You and your son need help, and I'm in a position to offer it. I don't know what the future holds, but I'm not leaving you two alone." Alira felt a warmth flood her chest, something unexpected. She had thought that once they were rescued, once they were safe, that she would be on her own again. But Alex's words changed that. He wasn't just offering a helping hand in the moment. He was offering something more. He was offering a future, a partnership, a chance to rebuild. "I don't know what to say," Alira replied, her voice full of emotion. "You're giving us more than I could have ever asked for." Alex smiled again, his eyes softening. "You don't have to say anything, I'm just doing what I can." They sat in silence for a moment, the only sound the low hum of the communication device. Alira's thoughts wandered again, but this time they didn't feel as heavy. There was still so much unknown, so much uncertainty, but for the first time in a long time, she allowed herself to think about what might come next. Maybe they would be rescued. Maybe they would find a new home. Maybe the future wasn't as bleak as she had once thought. As the hours passed, the storm outside began to subside. The winds weakened and the snow stopped falling so heavily. The light of the signal beacon, faint but still visible, seemed to pulse with new life, as though it, too, had found a glimmer of hope. "I think we've made it," Alex said quietly, standing up and adjusting his jacket. "We'll just have to wait a little longer." Alira nodded, feeling the weight of exhaustion settle over her. But it was a different kind of exhaustion now. It wasn't the kind of tiredness that came from a fight for survival. It was the kind that came from hope, from the possibility of something better, Taro was still asleep, his breathing steady, his small body finally resting. Alira looked down at him, a soft smile tugging at her lips. This was what mattered. Her son. Her future. And with Alex beside them, maybe, just maybe, they could rebuild what they had lost. "We'll be all right," Alira whispered, more to herself than to anyone else. But in that moment she believed it.